said before, when you do this, hopefully this will start where I paused it. When you try integrity of video, the video turns out to be very choppy because I guess it samples it. I don't know all the technical reasons, but you get pretty smooth audio. So I'm gonna. I don't know why it didn't stay where I wanted it. Okay, so this is one we've already seen.
In 4th century BC Athens, the philosopher Plato tried to define the basic parts of human nature.
Let me speak briefly about the nature of the soul by using an image. And let the image have 3 parts. A pair of winged horses.
We're not going to go into
One of the
Plato's
horses is of noble breed, the other ignoble.
soul.
And the charioteer controls them with great difficulty. The vicious steed, when it has not been thoroughly trained, goes heavily, weighing down the charioteer to the earth. Above them, in the heaven above heaven, there abides the true reality with which real knowledge is concerned. The forms, which are visible only to the mind and have no color, shape, or hardness. The souls that are most like God's are carried up there by their charioteer, although troubled by their steeds, and only with difficulty beholding true being. Other souls rise only to fall again, barely glimpsing it, and then altogether failing to see because their steeds are too unruly.
So this is Plato thinks that
a human being is
by practicing
essentially
philosophy will come out
a
better
human
than the
being's soul.
afterlife.
So the body is more something that the soul resides in. And he considers the soul to be composed of 3 parts. Now there's the rational part, there's the emotional or spirited part, the part which feels anger, and the appetitive part, which gives us our basic appetites for food, drink, sex. Human excellence is to be achieved. Where these 3 parts work together efficiently and cooperatively, and Plato says that can only happen where the rational part is ruling the soul.
I think the problem with this whole picture is, if reason is seen as human, then of course we, the whole person, will identify with the rational part. If you think you're a chariot and there's a charioteer and 2 horses, then you'll think the real you is the charioteer, of course. The real you is the little human in you. And what I think is a bit suspicious is the fact that parts of us are seen as animals, that is, as something less than human.
It's not that we're not going to have passions. It's that we're going to have passions in the right way. We're going to deal with our passions in the right way. We're going to give them expression where appropriate. Same with appetites. Plato's not recommending a kind of ascetic life of repetitive denial. It's a matter of feeding our appetites, allowing our appetites their satiation in the appropriate way, at the appropriate times, with the appropriate objects.
Plato's student Aristotle agreed with Plato's analysis of human nature. But he also took a broader view and asked how humans fit into nature as a whole. In Aristotle's view, everything has its own unique purpose, or in the Greek word, telos.
Surely, just as each part of man, the eye, the hand, the foot, has a purpose, so also man as a whole must have a purpose. What is this purpose? Our biological purpose we share in common even with plants. So these cannot be the purpose or function of man, since we are looking for something specific to man. The activities of our senses we also plainly share with other things, horses, cattle, and other animals. So there remains only the activities that belong to the rational part of man. The specific purpose or function of man involves the activities of that part of his soul that belongs to reason.
Suppose you were Aristotle, living 400 years before Christ, many centuries before the emergence of modern science. You look around and you try to understand what the world is like. You ask questions to yourself about why things are the way they are. And you ask, why does it rain? It's mysterious. This water just falls from the sky. You don't know how the water gets there. You don't know what principles account for its falling. You don't know why it falls here rather than there. You don't know why the rain fell yesterday rather than today. It's all just a complete mystery. And you try to think of some explanation that would answer a question like this: why does it rain? Aristotle was a smart guy. Aristotle was smarter than me and you and anybody that's going to see this program. And Aristotle came up with this answer. He says, basically, the rain falls so that the plants can grow. The world is a system of interlocking purposes. So the rain falls because if there were no rain, plants would dry up and die. Well, why are there plants? Plants provide food for the animals. Why are there animals? The animals provide food for us, and their skins are useful as clothing and for other purposes. Why do we exist?
The specific purpose or function of man involves the activities of that part of his soul that belongs to reason.
The mental abilities are just different in kind from anything else you see in nature. So it's the exercise of our mental abilities that must be our purpose, Aristotle thought.
The belief that humans are superior to animals is also central to the Judeo-Christian tradition. In the book of Genesis, on the sixth day of creation, with earth, sea, the heavens, and everything else in place,
God made the beast of the earth after his kind, and cattle after their kind, and every living thing that creepeth upon the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth.
in what sense are humans made in the image of God?
The way in which the early Christians answered that question is by drawing upon Greek philosophy. Plato had earlier said that and Aristotle had repeated after him, that reason in man is godlike, is divine. That reason is the most divine aspect of our nature. And so the Christians took those notions and wove them into their understanding of human beings.
Other important dimensions of human nature are revealed in the story of the fall, also in Genesis. God forbids Adam and Eve only one thing, to eat fruit from the tree of knowledge. But the serpent tempts Eve. She eats the fruit and shares it with Adam.
Very nice.
Because of that story, early Christianity comes to believe that there is in us the marks of the punishment that God exacted from us in that garden.
Those marks of punishment became known as original sin and are closely tied to another aspect of human nature, free will.
If you look at the Greeks and read Plato and Aristotle, you do see some discussions of choice, but you don't see will being given the central place in human nature that it acquires once Christianity comes on the scene, in large part because of their reading of this fundamental choice that is made in the Garden of Eden.
In Plato, reason must struggle to control our passions and appetites. In the Christian tradition, spirit wars with flesh to control our free will. No one portrays this war more vividly than the 4th century church father St. Augustine. To show how deeply sin is embedded in human nature, he tells a story from his youth.
Near our vineyard there was a pear tree loaded with fruit. I and some other wretched youths conceived the idea of shaking the pears off this tree and carrying them away. We set out late at night and stole all the fruit that we could carry, and this was not to feed ourselves. We may have tasted a few, but then we threw the rest to the pigs. Our real pleasure was simply in doing something that was not allowed. I did evil for nothing, with no reason for wrongdoing except the wrongdoing itself. I loved the sin, not the thing for which I had committed the sin, but the sin itself.
The writings of Plato influenced Christianity almost from its beginning. Aristotle's writings were not translated into Latin and widely read until the 13th century. One of the first to pick up his ideas was St. Thomas Aquinas. For Aquinas, as for Aristotle, human nature is defined by our special purpose or goal.
So remember, we looked at
Aquinas added to his picture that was not present in Aristotle is the notion that this goal was put there by God. It's a creator God who makes things, designs things in such a way as to be oriented to the goals that it has. The goal-oriented nature, then, of all things, according to Aquinas, is there because of the way in which God has designed the universe.
The celestial bodies cause the generation of all things here below. So the purpose of their motion is the generation of things below. Now here below, the simplest elements exist for the sake of compound minerals. These latter exist for the sake of living bodies, among which plants exist for animals and animals for humans. So, humans are the purpose of the whole order of generation. Now humans naturally desire, as their ultimate purpose, to know the first cause of things. But the first cause of all things is God. So the ultimate purpose of humans is to know God.
The ideas about human nature that have come down to us through the Greek and Christian traditions feel familiar and comfortable. But they can pose problems. Feminists point out that reason is often seen as a masculine trait. Women are seen as creatures of emotion, or worse yet, symbols of the temptations of the flesh. Other critics point out that people in power have often claimed that their natural superiority justifies domination over others. Rome, the Crusades, colonialism, slavery, instances in which people of reason felt compelled to civilize barbarians. This pattern comes out even in Plato's story of the charioteer.
And the chief trouble about Plato's three-part division of the soul is that it's got to do two jobs. It was designed to do two jobs, the psychological part and the political part. And he's got to get the psychological story to fit the political story. And the idea is that the rational part corresponds to the ruling class, the spirited part belongs to the military class, and the desiring part belongs to the worker. And the trouble about this is the obvious one. It gives rise to an authoritarian politics.
For Aristotle, reason defined human nature, but it wasn't given out equally.
He believed that women were intellectually and ethically inferior to men. And his modern defenders wave that aside and they say, well, that's just a mistake that he happened to make. Well, it's a rather big mistake to make. I mean, it shows how much the thing is ridden by the local conventions. He defended slavery in a way, which is, I mean, actually most of the Greeks didn't. Most Greeks thought that slavery wasn't just, they thought it was necessary. He went out of the way to try and show it was just.
The most powerful challenge to the traditional Western view of human nature has come from biology.
In a previous, not exactly pre-Darwinian, but we'll call it pre-French Revolution era, the
what we now think of as the life sciences were primarily interested in classification. That's what Linnaeus gave us, the classification we still use with adaptations today. You laid out living things on a great table. Literally, you had these collectors who had tables of butterflies and things. And metaphorically, you had these tables in books which would classify all the species.
The species were eternal. They didn't have births. They didn't develop. One thing didn't turn into another.
One of the consequences of European imperial expansion and a fascination with collecting specimens was that, as well as bringing back live specimens, people also brought back dead specimens. In Paris and London, the docks of the Thames or of the Seine would be filled with crates of mammoths which were being unloaded. And here was a problem. I mean, here was a species which didn't exist, and it wasn't some kind of obscure little beetle, which we couldn't really tell. Here was something absolutely massive, and this was when one of these ships came in. It was a big social occasion. People would go down and see these big bones being taken off, and people had to rethink, what is a species? And begin to think, well, maybe species can just die out. Species aren't flat, they're historical. And that happened before Darwin was born.
It would be Charles Darwin, though, who put the pieces together, creating a new picture of nature, a picture that forced us to look again at our views of human nature. In the 1830s, Darwin traveled to the Galapagos Islands to research both living species and fossils. He observed striking patterns, subtle differences among life forms on different islands, larger differences but also clear connections to species on mainland South America 600 miles away.
As more individuals are produced than can possibly survive, there must in every case be a struggle for existence. Can we doubt that individuals that have an advantage over others would have the best chance of surviving and of procreating their kind? Take the case of a wolf, which preys on various animals. The swiftest and slimmest wolves would have the best chance of surviving, and so be preserved or selected. This preservation of favorable individual differences and the destruction of those which are injurious, I have called natural selection, or the survival of the fittest.
And that simple ratchet will reiterate and reiterate and reiterate over time, and this gradual process will improve design in myriad ways. And that's the basic idea of natural selection. There's differential reproduction, and some, which is the same as to say there's a selective pressure of some sort, so that not all offspring are created equal. And that's enough to set the process going.
Before Darwin, it was reasonable to believe that human beings were radically different from, set apart from, the rest of creation. According to Darwin, human beings are not created specially by God in his own image. Human beings have evolved by the same processes that govern the evolution of the rest of the biological world. Man is the rational animal in the traditional formulation. Darwin specifically denied that. Yes, human beings are rational, but so are other animals. The only difference is a matter of degree, not of kind.
Evolutionarily speaking, the basic design of primate brains has been a design that's been around for many millions of years, and we have many small modifications or variations on that basic theme, of which the human brain is but one.
What we are is very highly evolved creatures which are related to every other living thing on this planet. And what we are is a huge assembly of cells, more than 1 trillion in each one of us. And each of those cells is the daughter or granddaughter or great-granddaughter of another cell. And this goes back, ultimately, billions of years to the first replicators on this planet. So if you want to understand what we are, you have to go back to the beginning of life on Earth and realize that right from the outset, there were these Very simple little robotic molecules, really, very complicated molecules that could reproduce themselves. And they didn't know any better, they didn't know what they were doing, they didn't care, but they could reproduce, and some of them could reproduce better than others. And that was the key.
If all creatures evolve through a struggle to survive and reproduce, what becomes of Aristotle's and Aquinas' notion that everything in nature has a special telos or purpose?
Darwin gave us a new model of explanation. Prior to Darwin, you would have said, for example, the fish has the shape that it has in order to enable it to swim in water. But what we now say is, look, there's a mechanical explanation. There's a genetic, a DNA explanation of why the fish has that shape. But, and now this is the second level of explanation, fish that have that shape are more likely to survive in water than fish that don't. A fish that's the shape of a brick isn't going to do as well in water as a fish that has a fishy shape to it.
So Aristotle would say that telos comes first. It is the source. It is the goal to which all being strives. And after Darwin, we say no. Telos comes later. It is itself a creation of a process which itself has no telos.
If human nature is not distinct from the rest of nature, then why do humans live so differently from other animals?
Okay. That last statement really sums up Darwin's original view that evolution is a random process, that some species develop mutations that actually enable them to survive better than other members of the species. And in the struggle for survival, natural selection selects the members of the species like the slimmest wolves, like the giraffes with longer necks. Those are selected by a random process for survival, and the others die out. And so the idea is that, we get much more complexity over time. Now, one of the things that that your book points out, I think, is that a traditional view, like the Judeo-Christian view of creation and the defense of the design argument, is not necessarily incompatible with evolution. It's incompatible with Darwin's original view of evolution as an entirely random process. Now, I run the Baltimore Backgammon Club. In backgammon, we use precision dice. They're ground to a tolerance of a thousandth of an inch, so you get a very accurate roll according to laws of probability. And the point is, though, if you take a fair dice, you put them in the dice cup and you shake them out, and say you get a 7 and a 7, like a 5 and a 2. Well, if you run that random process again, you put the dice back in the shaker on your next turn, you shake them and you throw them out, you may not get a 7. Maybe you get 2 6s. And this is Darwin's view, that evolution is not aimed at any goal or purpose, that it's only a happy accident that it produced us. And one of the things a contemporary evolutionist said is that if we ran the whole process again over from scratch, like putting the dice in the dice cup and shaking it again, there's no guarantee that it would get us. So that was Darwin's original view of evolution as a completely blind, statistical process, and what produced us is a series of happy accidents. But it's possible to be a theistic evolutionist. And theistic evolutionists point out things like the planets aren't even created till about the third or fourth day in Genesis. So how can day mean a 24-hour day when the Earth wasn't even round? Also, the word day in the original Hebrew can mean a 24-hour period, but it can also mean an eon of time. So there's a way of interpreting Genesis that allows for millions of years. The design argument and intelligent design and creation doesn't have to be bound up with what is called the young Earth theory, that this planet is only 6,000 years old, which a man named Usher arrived at the date of creation as 4004 BC by following out all the begats, all the genealogies in Genesis, But it's possible, and your book points this out, to believe that rather than being a blind process, that evolution can be a goal-directed, God-directed process. And theistic evolutionists disagree as to how much intervention they think there was. Some think that God just got it all going, and afterwards everything just runs itself. Other people think that there were interventions along the way. Well, okay. So that's the original, design argument. We're going to see. Now, remember, Hume is writing in the 1770s. Darwin gets out his theory of evolution, publishes it in the 1840s, right? So Hume didn't read Darwin, right? But Hume hints at some of the conclusions of evolutionary theory, that there may be forces in nature itself that account for order and design, for the order we see. We're not going to look at the problem of evil. We can't do everything. As I said, we're kind of behind a little bit because of the weather. But Hume, in the dialogues concerning natural religion, is Philo for the philosopher. The character Cleanthes is a made-up name, putting together the words anthropos for man or human being, and thees for theism. He's somebody who wants to hold, as traditional, say, Christianity holds, that God has human-like qualities. But Cleanthes is a character who wants a real rational defense of his faith. And he puts a lot of stock in these naturalistic arguments. He's not as inclined to, say, take the Bible literally and to, look for miracles, whereas Damia, the other character, is. I was reading some of the essays last night on Plato's allegory of the cave, and it's good that you all took to heart what we were saying, and many people summarize the argument before inputting their own views into it. And you'll see this is a practice that even David Hume does. He has the character Cleanthes state the design argument, that the world is like a complex machine, right? Subdivided into an infinite number of smaller machines. And all these machines and their parts, much like Paley's watch, are admirably and accurately adjusted to one another, like the parts of a watch. And throughout nature, then, when he says means are adopted to ends in ways that resemble yet exceed the products of human design. So here is purpose built in. The idea is that the parts of things like the eye and the ear and other things in nature work together, just like the parts of a watch, to serve a particular function or purpose. So there is telos, there is purpose, built in. So the traditional Aristotelian way of looking at nature and the traditional Judeo-Christian view sees nature as imbued with purposes, as the evidence of design. So that's a summary of the basic parts of the design argument. And everyone considers this to be what logicians call an argument from analogy. Now, you know what an analogy is. Basically, when you argue a point from analogy, what you do is you basically say, well, hey, look, A is like B in respects 1 and 2, and that's your premises. That's what gets your argument off. And so you say, well, maybe, or there's a good probability that A will be like B in a further respect. Call it 3. So look at Paley's argument. The watch is like an organ like the human eye in the respects of having various parts that seem to work together to serve a purpose or function, right? So there are ways in which a human product of design, a watch, seems to resemble something in nature like the eye or the ear. And then, of course, Paley would go on and say, well, here are two things that both seem to exhibit telos. They exhibit the property that they've got parts that seem to work together to fulfill a purpose. Maybe, just maybe, they're alike in a further respect. And that is, we know that the watch didn't just get there like the stone. It had to have been designed and made specifically by an intelligence, a rational designer. And similarly, we can say, well, the eye or the ear might need a designer as well. And so the analogy says that the effects, the products of design, resemble each other. So by analogy, the cause must resemble each other also. And so the idea is we needed an intelligence to design something like a watch. And so we also can conclude then that the designer of the eye and the ear is an intelligence. So the author of nature, God, has a mind like the human mind, except because things in nature are so much more complex than simple things like a tick-tock watch. The idea is that God has larger faculties, that God is much higher an intelligence than as a designer than than human beings, since the products of design happen to be much more complex and grander. So the conclusion then is that God exists and has an intelligence similar but exceeding human intelligence. Now, I'm not going to stay on this, but Damia objects because he would rather see something like the ontological argument as a proof for God, an airtight mathematical proof. An argument from analogy is what we call an inductive or probabilistic argument. It says that even if its premises are true, it just says that that there's a good probability the conclusion is true. Whereas an argument in mathematics or something like the ontological argument says if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true, given the truth of the premises. They establish the conclusion the premises do with absolute certainty. And this is the kind of thing that Damia would like to see. He doesn't like it that the design argument is only a probabilistic argument. And he longs for something like the ontological argument. Whereas Philo, and remember Philo is Hume here, Philo says, look, that's not my quibble with this. He says, I don't object that the design argument is only a probabilistic argument. But what he thinks is that it's a bad argument from analogy. In other words, not every argument from analogy is a good argument, but Hume will agree that some arguments from analogy are. He says we can have other probable arguments like a stone's going to fall if we let it go, that fire will burn, right? I mean, I don't put my finger above a lit match, saying, well, maybe it won't burn my finger this time, right? That the earth has solidity. He says there are a lot of conclusions we can come to because, to put it in sort of contemporary parlance, we're comparing apples with apples. And we have a lot of different examples. I mean, when I strike a match, I expect the doggone thing to light. Why? Because I've seen that happen countless times in the past. So he says the exact similarity of cases assures us of a similar event. But what Hume is going to try to say is, one, he says, we only have one example of design. I mean, one kind of joke we used to say is we can give a final exam that says, well, describe the universe and give two examples, But Hume says, well, we only have this universe to go on. We don't have many examples of design. And in that sense, the design argument isn't like some of these others. We have only one example of design, our present. But he also says, look, maybe it's only a weak analogy to compare, the development of the world or the, things in nature to the products of human design, like a house or given Paley a watch. So in the next few slides, what Hume tries to do is give us an example of a good versus a bad argument from analogy. He says if we depart from the similarity of the compared cases, that diminishes the evidence. So he's trying to say that we can't compare the building of something like a house or, given Paley, the structure of a watch, with the making of the universe. Hume says, consider something like the circulation of the blood. If we're comparing something, exact cases, right, like comparing the circulation of blood in two human beings, he says it's beyond doubt that we can conclude that, you know, blood circulates in another human being the way it does in us. And Hume says even if we depart from the similarity and take other animals like a frog, still, he says, we've got an argument from analogy that says, well, you know, blood must circulate in us the way it does in this frog. But Hume says, suppose we took things that are really very far apart, that had only superficial similarities. I mean, the stalks of plants do have like tubules, and there's sap that goes through them, right? But now that's definitely wrong. But the point is, it's 10:46. The point is, he says it would be wrong for us to conclude that sap in plants, just because of the superficial resemblance of the tubules in a plant or a tree to human veins, it would be wrong for us to conclude by analogy that sap in plants circulates much the way that blood does in animals and human beings. One of the reasons you see the trees without any leaves is we know that the sap in winter, the sap goes down, you know, along with the chlorophyll into the roots of the tree, leaving the xanthophyll and the carotene. That's what turns the leaves yellow and orange that we see in the fall. Sap doesn't circulate. You know, so Hume is saying if we are comparing two things that are not very similar, we're not on real good ground in using an argument from analogy. And so he says, on seeing a house, we conclude with the greatest certainty that it had a builder. I'm in an old house that my parents, we moved into in 1955 in Hamden. The records go back to 1900, but it's probably older than that. Neither I nor my parents were around when the house was built, and yet I believe the house did have a designer and builder, right? That it didn't just get there, right? Because other houses I've seen had designers and builders, right? So I conclude that my house must have. But what Hume is saying is, how much is the universe like a house? Or how much is the eye or the ear like a watch? You know. Okay. There's not too much more of this, but we have to break it off there because it's time to go. So somebody bring the roll up, and so we'll see. Next time we're going to go over Descartes' Meditations. So go down in your syllabus to the Meditations. I'll have a PowerPoint because we're going to finish up with this pretty quickly. There's not much more in this PowerPoint on the design argument. Okay, thanks a lot for coming out this morning. And so again, we'll my plan is to have everything graded and figured out, and for us to go over the tests on Monday. So I'll see you. Have a good